The brutal power struggle unfolding in Sudan has no clear end in sight. After the joy and hope of the democratic protests that led to the fall of Omar al-Bashir, the country has been unable to escape the shadow of his regime and the men who wish to succeed him. For more on the conflict and what might happen next, we're joined via video by Nicholas Westcott, the director of the Royal African Society. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Could you start by explaining a bit about how we got here? Were you surprised when this fighting erupted almost 2 weeks ago now?
Sadly, not surprised at all. The rivalry between Burhan as head of the sort of established Sudan armed forces and General Dagalo, better known as Hemedti, running the paramilitary rapid support force, has been long-standing. They were allies only of convenience, and the main convenience they had was to run the civilians out of power when the moment of transition came in the political transitional agreement. And it was fairly inevitable that they would fall out with each other because their interests are different. Hemedti represents the periphery around Sudan, coming from Darfur with a paramilitary force often of dispossessed, unemployed young men, whereas Burhan, at the head of the Sudan armed forces, very much the Khartoum elite, the establishment, if you like, because effectively under Bashir, the military continued to run the country and increasingly the economy. So the army has a lot of economic interests that it's desperate to hang on to, whereas Hemedti has seized control effectively of the gold fields. And they are fighting over resources, they're fighting over control, and unfortunately it's the people who've been suffering in that process.
And speaking of the people who've been suffering, the two of these men have collectively failed to restore power to civilians. Does either of them have any support from the wider population?
There were temporary alliances, if you like, and Hemedti posed as a champion of democracy in helping bring down Bashir in the first place. But and Burhan also had a constituency at some stage, the same as Bashir, amongst the middle-class Sudanese. But I think the civilian and particularly the democratic forces, the forces for change, feel now that they cannot trust either of these parties, that each of them is out only for itself. And yet, eventually, we will need to see a transition back to some kind of government that the people will consent with. It was the people that brought down Bashir, as you said earlier. And although these two military forces are fighting because they believe they can seize complete control, the people of Sudan are still there, 40, 50 million of them, and they can't completely ignore them. But we are not yet at a point where either military party is willing to actually bring the civilians back in, and the civilians would quite rightly be very suspicious of realigning with either side.
And what are your best and worst case scenarios right now for how this conflict could evolve?
The worst case is very grim. You end up with a kind of Syrian situation where the international community start taking sides, support their proxies, the war goes on indefinitely, and you actually find a situation where effectively the country is destroyed and somebody ends up in control of the ruins. Or you could see a South Sudan situation where effectively there's a frozen civil conflict between two sides that never quite resolves itself. But there is a potentially good outcome, but that will require the international community to act together. Because there are some countries that have influence on some of the parties. Egypt is quite close to General Burhan. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are influential. The Quad grouping, which is the US, the UK, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, they have a degree of influence. And the neighbors are also very concerned. If this conflict continues, it could increasingly spill over into their own countries, into Ethiopia, Chad, Egypt itself. So there is actually some common interest in the international community, and this would include China and Russia, to say to both parties, you're on a hiding to nothing. This is a route to nowhere. We have to find a way to settle this dispute. You must stop fighting. But at the moment, I fear these ceasefires are only temporary. It's a pause while they try to gather more ammunition. They let the international community out because then there will be less visibility. Then they can get on with the war. But throughout that, it is the Sudanese people who are suffering.
And does the international community also bear some responsibility for what's happened? Is there any way that they could have acted differently maybe when Bashir was ousted in the first place?
That's a good question. I think there was a lot of support for the democratic forces. It was perhaps a bit slow. It was very hard for the international financial institutions to mobilize money to back up the democratic government under Hamdok. And before the fighting broke out, there was very active diplomacy, but it failed. And I think partly that's because both sides, Burhan and Dagalo, felt that I have some international backers. Hemedti had been in Moscow, he'd been in Asmara talking to President Isaias. Burhan has friends in Cairo. So both sides thought, some in the international community will support me. So there's not yet a united voice amongst all the international community. At the moment, certainly in the UK, the whole focus is on we must get British citizens out of the way. But the politicians understand we actually have to stop the fighting and get a peace process going, but we are not there yet.
And what are the obstacles to that international voice of unity? Why aren't we there quite yet?
Different countries do have different interests, and there is a lot of diplomacy going on to try and persuade people like the Saudis, like the UAE, that it's not actually in their long-run interests for this conflict to go on, and therefore they must take a stronger line. The same also with Russia and Egypt. Egypt is a key player because they really don't want instability on their southern border. But also President al-Sisi, he feels quite close to General Burhan. They're both military men. He would like to see a strong figure in charge of Sudan and somebody who is friendly to him. So they're a little bit torn. They want to back up Burhan, but also they don't want the fighting to continue.
All right, Nicholas Westcott, thank you again so much for your time. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but it's very interesting to hear your insights. Again, that's Nicholas Westcott, Director of the Royal African Society.
Thank you.
For those of you